Well, it is time to start the book of Daniel. I'm so glad you're with us. I hope you're enjoying all of these videos. If you are, please hit the like button on the videos, subscribe to the channel, share the links out with your friends and on your other social sites to bring more people into our channel. We're just trying to help people to learn the scriptures without, I want to bring scholarship to you. I want to help you to understand, get just past the surface level into some of the deeper parts of the scriptures so that you can enjoy them more. And I hope if you've watched all of our videos, good on you. That's awesome. If you've been watching since Genesis, it's been a long journey so far, almost 2.5 years to make all these videos. But here's the beauty is we want you to really gain a deeper appreciation, understanding of these scriptures and what they can do in your life. So we're going to start Daniel. Now, Daniel, just to give you some background, most people understand a little bit about Daniel. Daniel in the lion's den and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace and things. Those are some of the cool stories we get from the book of Daniel. But let's talk about Daniel a little bit more himself. So Daniel was probably a young man in Jerusalem around 600 BC. For LDS people out there, there's a good chance Nephi and Daniel are relatively close in age, possibly, at least close enough to know who each other was. And in fact, there's no way to prove this, but theoretically you could say because Nephi and Daniel were relatively near in age, they lived in Jerusalem at the same time, there's a chance maybe they knew of each other. In fact, Chris Heimerdinger wrote a whole book, Nephi and Daniel, about this theory, this idea that maybe Nephi and Daniel were childhood friends or knew each other and then were later separated when Lehi and his family left Jerusalem around 600 BC. So Daniel is part of that faithful group that's in Jerusalem. And if you read in the book of Jeremiah, go through the book of Jeremiah, you'll get a little bit more about the destruction of Babylon, of Jerusalem by Babylon and how that broke down. Daniel is a part of the group of people that left in the first exile. There's actually 3 official exiles that Babylon does with the people in Jerusalem. We usually only hear of one, when Babylon destroys Jerusalem and takes the people back with them into Babylonia. But what we don't realize is this happened 3 times. Okay, the one in the middle is the one we hear about the most. That's a 587 BC. The first one is this one, 597 BC. So this is the time when Nebuchadnezzar comes down. He is occupying the land, taking this area over as he's getting rid of Assyria, and they've come down and they've basically making sure Egypt doesn't take anything and doesn't cause problems. And as he does this, at the time, Jerusalem had a pro-Egyptian king. And so he died. That was Jehoiakim. And then his son Jehoiachin took over, and Jehoiachin was only in for about 3 months when he got carted off to the exile. So the king, a lot of princes, a lot of high priests went. Ezekiel, in fact, the book we just finished, if you haven't watched those videos, he was a part of this group that was part of that first exile. And Daniel is part of that group too, with him and his friends. So they didn't go in the main exile, they went in the first exile, basically. Now, so I've got a couple things I want to read about Daniel and to help us understand what's going on here. This is a thought here. Daniel's another apocalyptic book like Isaiah and others. So many scholars think this cannot be prophecy, but things written down and set in the past as if it was a prophecy. Scholars think this book was put together around 10 BC, then added to the Daniel story to make it sound like prophecy. So if you watch our videos about Isaiah, we go into a lot more detail on this. Scholars, when they're trying to understand the scriptures, understand biblical scholarship and things, they run into a problem. You see, if God is real, and if God can talk to his people and tell them future things before they happen, then scholars have a hard time understanding what is prophetic and what might not be prophetic. And so what scholars have historically done is just said, we're just going to discount prophetic, the concept of prophecy. And we're going to look at this as if prophecy didn't exist. So the only way we could think of Daniel as actually being a book without prophecy is if it was written a long time after it happened. And then somebody took the story of Daniel and went, oh, let's throw these cool ideas into him to make it sound like it's a big deal. Now, back in the ancient world, because of the caste system that they had, if you weren't cream of the crop, born to the right family, nobody listened to you. If you were born down here, nobody listened to you, even if it was a good idea. You can get listened to. And so a lot of these people, if they had a good idea, what they would do is they would write the name of an important person on it. So this is reverse plagiarism. Okay, plagiarism is when you take somebody else's writings and you assume it's yours. You put it into your work or into your writings and just don't cite them. Don't say, hey, I got this from this person. You take the credit for it yourself. That's plagiarism. So reverse plagiarism is you take your works and you give it the name of somebody else. And so reverse plagiarism is a problem. And so that's where a lot of scholars come from in the book of Daniel. And it's the same with some of the prophecies of Isaiah as well. Scholars try to believe if we take the idea of God speaking to man out of the scriptures, then the only logical way that this would make sense is if it was written after the fact and then added later. But if you believe in prophetic revelation and in prophecy, then maybe Daniel wrote the whole book. That could be. So this is really interesting because if you think about it, Daniel, again, was in Babylon. He lived in Babylon. And he's really a good example of what does it mean to be righteous while living in enemy territory. So if you live in a place that isn't very gospel-oriented, Daniel's got some good examples for you of how to live, how to stay true to the gospel while living in a non-gospel-oriented society, basically. So a lot of good ideas here. So let's get started here. Verse 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and he was a wicked king. He was pro-Egypt. He was actually, if I remember right, appointed by Pharaoh Necho after Pharaoh was trying to fight. Pharaoh tried to help Assyria fight against Babylon and then got beat, basically, the battle of, I think that was Carchemish, and got beat back. And that's where we came in. So now, in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim's reign, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, this is probably not, historians look at this and go, that's probably not Nebuchadnezzar that actually was in the king at that time. In the Babylonian texts, it reads different. So in the Babylonian text, they believe this is Nebuchadnezzar's dad, Nabonidus. So let's read a little bit here. This could be Nabonidus, or there is a huge time gap between chapters 4 and 5. Later on in Daniel, we'll see this. If these first few chapters are about Nebuchadnezzar, then there is a large gap. If these first chapters are really about Nabonidus, but his dad was written in instead, then the story is different. We do not know which is the correct way to think about it. Or so Nabonidus was Nebuchadnezzar's son. Excuse me, I misspoke on that one. So this is actually from Wikipedia about Nabonidus. We don't hear about him a whole lot. We hear the name dealing with in the Battle of 300 from the Greeks and the Roman wars, but that's not the same Nabonidus that was in Babylon, basically. So in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, into Jerusalem and besieged it. So realize Jehoiakim was a wicked king of Judah. He was appointed, if I remember right, by Pharaoh Necho II. After Pharaoh Necho went up to help Assyria basically take out Babylon, and then lost, I believe that was the Battle of Carchemish. They retreated, came back down, and Jehoiakim was in place in Jerusalem. Basically, he's a pro-Egyptian king, and so when Nebuchadnezzar came through with his army, he took over the land, and he said, I don't want a pro-Egyptian ruler there. I need somebody who will follow me. But see, Jehoiakim died in that time frame when they replaced him with Jehoiachin, his son, and then his son got taken to that exile. So this is a little bit before that happened, basically. So verse 2, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. So this is basically Nebuchadnezzar taking over the area. He's going to take Jehoiakim, which actually at the time it should have been Jehoiachin who was there. Jehoiachin ruled for like 3 months. Jehoiakim died, Jehoiachin was there, and then Jehoiachin is the one that went to exile. He took all this, and then the vessels out of the house of God, so the temple vessels, the golden goblets and things out, And then they went to the land of Shinar. Now, Shinar was the plain of the lower delta country between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers where they approached the Persian Gulf. This was the ancient land of Chaldea or Babylonia. So if you look at the present-day Iraq, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers kind of run on a slant through the country of Iraq, basically, and over in that area was Babylonia. I think it was probably a little south and east of present-day, the capital of Iraq, basically. The name of that capital just left me. Sorry about that. But it's kind of down in that area. So verse 3, and the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes. So again, he's saying, okay, you go and you need to gather these people and bring them. So this is interesting, the word eunuch that he mentions here in verse 3. Okay, the word eunuch is the English form of the Greek word, which means bed keeper. In the strict and proper sense, they were the persons who had charge of the bedchambers in palaces and larger houses. But as the jealous and dissolute temperament of the East required this charge to be in the hands of persons who had been deprived of their virility, the word eunuch came naturally to denote persons that in that condition. But as some of these rose to be confidential advisors of their royal masters or mistresses, the word was occasionally employed to denote persons in such a position without indicating any of their proper manhood. That's Smith in his Dictionary of the Bible. So what that means basically is usually when we hear the word eunuch, we think of a man who's been castrated, basically, has no testicles anymore. Oftentimes they would do this. Sometimes this would be offered as like a sacrifice to God. I'm going to dedicate my life to God, and so I can't have a family. In this sense, they would hire men to watch over, basically, a king would have a man, and this man's job is to basically take care of the harem, all the wives and the concubines of the king, and make sure they're taken care of and things. The problem is this man may want to sleep with some of the king's women. And if one of the king's wives got pregnant from somebody other than the king, this was a bad thing and caused a lot of problems in a kingdom. And so these men oftentimes were eunuchs. Now this concept kind of stuck around, and sometimes they would use men for these things as well as advisors. And so the idea of a eunuch, it became more of a title than a description of a person over time. So some people were called eunuchs because they were servants of the king, but they weren't actually castrated men, basically. So that's what that's talking about there. So Nebuchadnezzar is sending one of his assistants to gather up the princes. It says here, let's see, verse 3, should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes. So royalty, bring them together, and let's bring them into exile. So verse 4, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom and cunning, in knowledge and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. So these aren't just, let's just get a bunch of kids and bring them. Let's get the cream of the crop. Let's get the smartest kids, and we'll take them into Babylonia, and then we're going to educate them in our cultures and ideas so they can teach everybody else. So it was a specific group of people that they wanted, basically. Now, verse 5, and the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat, and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, and at the end thereof they might stand before the king. So standing before the king means they'll be an advisor. They're there to help the king, basically give him advice. But they wanted them to be well indoctrinated, so they gave them 3 years to study and to eat of the king's portion, basically eat the king's meat. So they were getting lots of food like the kings would get. Now this is interesting because most of the time it was royalty that had the most. In today's world, we would call these chronic inflammatory issues like gout, fibromyalgias, heart disease, dementias, things like that. Not a lot of people would get those back then because that meant you had a lot of inflammatory issues inside. Eating an abundant diet, you were more likely to have those kinds of problems. So these people would kind of go that direction. They'd be fattened up. They wouldn't be eating meagerly like they probably were in other places. So verse 6, now among these were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Okay, so these are Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, I want you to look at these names for a second here. We're going to get into this in verse 7. Unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names. For he gave unto Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and Azariah of Abednego. Now let's look at this, okay? If you look at these original names, you have to think of anytime you see an I-A-H or I-A-L, like they have like Daniel's I-E-L, but it's kind of the same thing. The endings of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah all represent Hebrew God, basically. That's what they meant. That means God in the Hebrew tongue. So he's giving them Chaldean names that represent the Chaldean God. So Shadrach is Hananiah, Meshach is Mishael, Abednego is Azariah. These are the strength of the Lord, basically. So the new names will remind them of the Babylonian gods, not the Jewish God, basically. So they're really changing them. They're going, okay, your guys' names represent the God of Israel. So we're going to change your names so you can help represent the God of Babylon. This is, if you think of this indoctrination, they're Babylonifying the people. They're bringing them into the Babylonian culture and integrating them into, we want you to worship our way. We want you to believe our way, basically. That's what's going on there. That's why they got those new names. Now, verse 8, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So Daniel, we could look at this from an LDS standpoint. You could say Daniel's keeping the word of wisdom. He's not eating a lot of meat. That's not really true. The word of wisdom didn't necessarily exist back then. But what it is in Daniel's time, the law of Moses gave certain requirements and restrictions. And so the Jews had dietary restrictions. And so he's going, nope, I want to follow my dietary restrictions of my people, not what the king is eating, basically. So he wants to stay. He thinks being Babylonified is going to defile him, make him unworthy of following his God. And so he's saying, look, this is kind of against my religion to do this, basically. So let me eat what I'd like to eat. Now, verse 9, he says, now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. So Daniel and this prince were pretty good friends. They'd gotten to know each other and liked each other. So verse 10, and the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and for your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall ye make me endanger my head to the king. So what's happening here is he's going, look, if you don't eat the same food as everybody else, basically, you're going to look malnourished. You're going to look like you do right now, malnourished, versus everybody else is going to have some meat on their bones. They're going to get fat like the king and everybody else. So I'm worried because if the king sees that you are basically sickly compared to everybody else, I'm going to get blamed for it. And that means I could be killed. I could be executed for not following the king's orders, basically. So that's what this prince of the eunuchs is telling him. Like, look, man, you're putting my life on the line here by doing this. So verse 11, then said Daniel to Melzar, that's the first time we actually get the prince of the eunuchs' name is right there. Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And you notice they didn't use their Babylonian names, they used their Hebrew names. Let's see, verse 12, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days. Let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, and as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So verse 14, so he consented to them in this manner and proved them 10 days. So what Daniel said was, I'll tell you what, I understand where you're coming from. I'll tell you what, let me eat the way I want to eat for 10 days and compare my health and abilities with everybody else. And if you think they're better, then we'll switch and do that way. If you think I'm better, then let us stay where we're at. Let us keep doing what we're doing. And he went, oh, okay, that sounds good. Because if you can show that what you're doing is going to still keep you nourished and healthy, then my life's not on the line, basically. So that's what he said here. Basically, give us a chance to prove it. We're going to do a small experience, small little test here, small experiment, basically. Now, a lot of people ask, well, what is this pulse? This has been asked for a long, long time. What is pulse? It's a combination of seeds, grains like peas, wheat, barley, rye, a bunch of things like that. So this is proteins and fibers basically mixed together to a really dense type of, if you think about this cooked into a bread, this would be a really high dense bread, really healthy bread for you. So and the thing to think about too is while this would be a healthy combination, like we can look at that idea and say, okay, seeds are going to get you some proteins and fats. Peas will get you some proteins as well as fiber. Wheat usually has protein and fiber. Barley and rye are usually protein with fiber in their soluble and insoluble fiber. So it's really almost a good keto type diet if you think about it. We wouldn't think about it as keto. We don't think of bread as keto today because most bread today is starch. Any bread that you can just take your hands and squeeze, you know, if you can give your bread to a 4-year-old and they can just squeeze it and crush it, that's starch. Okay, this kind of bread is like thick. Like you have to have a really big sharp knife to cut through this. It is thick. The bread itself, eating a piece of toast would fill you up. It's not just there to hold the middle of your sandwich together, basically. This is a healthier type of bread. This is the more of the kind of bread we should be eating in everyday stuff if you get into studying nutrition and understanding that better. But also realize that this would be keeping the commandments of God. So by keeping the commandments of God, they're going to be extra blessed, not just from the health benefits of the bread, but blessings from God because they're keeping his commandments. So that's what they're saying here, basically. So look at us, compare us with everybody else, and let's see what happens. So verse 15, at the end of the 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. So Melchizedek went, oh my gosh, you guys are actually the healthiest out of everybody here. So what does he do? Verse 16, thus Melchizedek took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink and gave them pulse. So he's like, we're going to get rid of the meats and the wines, which is a lot of starches and sugars and carbohydrates and things sometimes in there, depending on the kind of wine you have, of course. If it's more fruit, then maybe not as much carbohydrate. And we're going to put you on this more of a leaner protein and fiber diet, basically, which is more, really, it's a little more keto than just wine and meat. Basically, when you think of keto, you think of meat. But actually, this is a little more pulse. It would be almost a little more appropriately keto because of the fiber in there with the proteins. So now Melchizedek is taking everybody off of the king's portion and giving them what Daniel and his friends were eating. So verse 17, as for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now, a lot of people will refer to this story too when you think about the word of wisdom. The word of wisdom in section 89 of the Doctrine and Covenants does talk about having knowledge, even hidden knowledge. So that could be like this idea that we get in verse 17 as well, that Daniel and his friends were blessed with extra knowledge and understanding of things because of keeping the commandments. Verse 18, now at the end of the days that the king had said that he should bring them in, so the 3 years, remember, that they were nourished and trained and indoctrinated and done this, now it's time for them to come before the king. And then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So again, in the Hebrew Bible, we're still using their Hebrew names. Therefore stood they before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. Now the Hebrew word for astrologers and magicians is ashafim, which means an enchanter who uses incantations and who practices hidden arts. This is Davidson's Analytical Hebrew and Chaldea lexicon. So they found that Daniel and his 3 friends were greatly blessed in wisdom and in understanding of things. Like just, they were smarter than most of the king's current advisors, basically. So they really stood out among the people. And now verse 21, and Daniel continued even unto the 1st year of King Cyrus. So verse 21 is a little forward thinking, realizing we're still under Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. But just to let you know, Daniel sticks around through King Cyrus in Persia later on. So that verse looks like 70 years in the future, basically. Daniel was really young. Realize for him to live 70 years, he was quite young when the exile happened. I mean, if he was 10 when the exile happened, he lived to be 80, which is an extra long life for an average person at that time. But he lived his whole life basically outside the promised land. He spent way more time in his life outside the promised land than in the promised land, if you think about that, basically. So an interesting perspective that we get just in that last little verse about Daniel and his life. So let's jump over to the next chapter as we continue in the story of Daniel.